Welcome to the first unit of our material, corresponding to the Banstra text, the Primeval Story. The Primeval Story. We're going to be looking at the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, with a few initial observations. Specifically, do we need a little bit of Sherlock Holmes to help us out with the first chapter of Genesis? In other words, when we look at this material, do we need to deduce a few things, maybe derive a few deductions from the first chapter of the book of Genesis? It really is a bit of a mystery when it comes to analyzing the text, figuring out when it was written, even who wrote it, and how many authors there might have been. So, are deductions allowable in a courtroom? What do you think? Are deductions allowable in court? Of course they are. It happens all the time. People, attorneys, assemble evidence and draw conclusions from the evidence they assemble and convince a jury. Well, academe is really all about drawing inferences from certain specific deductions, argued intelligently, in order to convince the court of public opinion. So, having said that,
What can you tell about me?
You. I don't think that's. I don't know that that's not a dinner. Perhaps some other time.
I insist.
You insist. You remember we discussed this. The lady insists. You're a governess.
Well done.
Yes, well done. Shall we? Waiter. Your student. It's a boy of age.
Charlie's 7, actually.
Finished tall for his age. He flicked ink at you today.
Is there ink on my face?
There's nothing wrong with your face. There are 2 drops on your ear, in fact. India blue is nearly impossible to wash off. Anyway, a very impetuous act by the boy, but you're too experienced to react rashly, which is why the lady for whom you worked lent you that necklace. Oriental pearls, diamonds, a flawless ruby, hardly the gems of governors. However, the jewels you are not wearing tell us rather more. Holmes, you were engaged. The ring is gone, but the lighter skin where it once sat suggests that you spent some time abroad, wearing it proudly, that is, until you were informed of its true and rather modest worth, at which point you broke off the engagement and returned to England for better prospects. Doctor, perhaps.
ooh, deductions can get you into trouble, and so they get biblical scholars into trouble all the time. And the bottom line is, there's very little we can really prove. So we can't insist that one deduction is right, another is wrong, one is better than another. Even the majority in the academic world have been wrong plenty of times. So when we approach Genesis 1, we're not trying to tell you that it happened one way or another. We're just presenting possibilities, and of course, you get to be the judge. Let's have a look at the text. Pretty familiar to most people. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and empty. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. The Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. That's Genesis 1:1. But wait a second. Let's look at chapter 2. Let's skip ahead a number of verses and consider chapter 2, the 4th verse. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the heaven, the earth, and the heavens. And every shrub of the field was not yet on the earth, and every plant of the field had not yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. Enter Sherlock, who can easily argue, and does, based on a clever deduction, that there's more than one creation account here. How many creation accounts are there? That's an academic issue that needs to be raised on our list of issues and phrased appropriately. A single creation account? Maybe more. Maybe 2 distinct accounts written by 2 different authors, and subsequently, we're talking centuries later, sewn together by a clever editor. The theory is that one author prefers the divine name YHWH in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, those are the actual Hebrew letters, not pronounced at all to observant Jews to this day. About Yah is all we can say. But you can guess how the rest of it might have been pronounced. So Lord is simply the substitution, the English substitution for that divine name that appears all over the biblical text. Except, wait a second, it's not in Genesis 1:1. We do find it in Genesis 2, the Lord God. So scholars theorize that there might have been a separate author who liked the divine name YHWH, used it, and was fascinated by the primeval early period. Let's call him the Yahwist. Then we consider that the growth of King David's monarchy, his dynasty, really inspired incredible interest in stories with global significance. That is, not just about the birth of the Israelite nation, but the creation of everything. So we got that going on as well. Some independent author who's interested in stories about the beginning of everything, the entire universe, and of course the world as we know it. And then the theory is that yet another source called P stands for the priestly source came along much, much later, actually during and after the Babylonian captivity of the Israelites in the 500s BCE and the return from Babylonian captivity to rebuild the fallen temple. So this priestly source came along and added various versions of the creation and the flood story of Noah. So that's the theory. It's also theorized that the writer who liked the divine name Elohim, known as the Elohist, isn't present at all in this story. All we have is the Yahwist and the priestly source. So the priestly source is presumed to have been the author of Genesis 1, and the Yahwist, who is seen as an outgrowth of the dynasty of King David, working under the Israelite monarchy in the southern kingdom of Israel, produced Genesis 2. Of course, there are always disagreements and arguments, and it's quite possible to poke holes in this entire so-called documentary hypothesis. Isn't it curious that the priestly source utilizes the name God or Elohim here in Genesis 1 when the same theory says that the Elohist is not present at all? Many different problems with this whole hypothesis, but that's the name of the game. So to summarize what's going on, as Bandstra does, we've got a storyline, God creating the universe of stars, earth, animal life, resting on the seventh day, and then humans placed in this perfect Eden, this paradise, only to be expelled after they disobeyed the divine command. Obviously, Eve it is who takes the forbidden fruit and gives it to Adam, and they're both expelled from Eden. Once they're out of Eden, the first couple has offsprings who typify the worst kind of sin, but also the best of culture. Sin, however, runs rampant. God decides to destroy the earth, cleanse it with a flood, saving only Noah, righteous Noah and his immediate family. Also, a sample of all the animal life Two by two, they come in pairs in a boat, an ark designed by God. So the earth floods, the waters subside, Noah leaves the ark, and God makes a covenant with him, an agreement, a covenant. Noah, however, gets drunk, and that marks the return of wrongdoing. Even so, humanity grows in number. They start building a massive tower. We've all heard of the Tower of Babel, ascending to heaven, because they want to make a name for themselves. God, however, frustrates their plan, scatters them far and wide, and this primeval story ends with the genealogy of Shem. It's from his line that we get Father Abraham, the great Israelite patriarch. And it's through Abraham that God will reestablish fellowship with humanity. That's the background, that's the primeval story. Now, what about this presumed priestly source? They came out of the Babylonian captivity hundreds of years later in the 500s BC. Here, these priests find themselves in exile. Their homeland has been destroyed, their temple destroyed. But they're looking forward to the reestablishment of a new temple and a new sacrificial system. And sure enough, that happens. A second temple is built in 515 BCE, at least dedicated in that year. So these priests, living in the 6th century before the Common Era, begin to write into the Torah, as it were, ascribing it to Moses, who lived centuries and centuries before them. But they write in all manner of laws having to do with ritual, sacrifice, ritual slaughter of animals, all the ins and outs of the sacrificial system, the Sabbath day and how properly to observe it, all manner of kosher food laws, what you can eat, what you can't eat. And they are also theorized to have built this whole 7-day cycle, including the Sabbath, and really given us the concept of the Sabbath day. Now, is this just clever deduction? Is it dead on, as Sherlock would like to be all the time? Or can you poke holes in this? If this theory is correct, then of course it means that Moses didn't write most of what's ascribed to him in the books of Moses. So that's really troublesome to a lot of people. Genesis 1, again, it's theorized that these priests wrote Genesis 1 and perhaps formed it as a kind of liturgy, something maybe to be recited in the renewed temple. That's another issue, by the way. What was Genesis 1? Was it just a narrative, just a story, or was it something to be used in temple liturgy, in temple worship? So all these issues are swirling around. Now, let's look at Genesis 1:1 again, and let's look at it in the Hebrew. Now, Hebrew is not required to take this course. That's okay. We'll explain it to you where necessary, and we'll also recite a little of it from time to time. Right up here at the top, you see, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. That is generally translated, in the beginning, God created, literally the verb is first, created God, the heavens and the earth. But to be honest, there's another way to read that in the Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In other words, while God, or as God was creating the heavens and the earth, comma, then you read the next line, Va'aretz hayta tohu vevohu, and the earth was formless and void. So if we read it that way, which many scholars insist is the proper way to read it, we get a completely different understanding. It's not that God created ex nihilo, that means out of nothing, the heavens and the earth. That's not what the text is saying. It's as though there's something there already, some formless void that's already present that God is working on and working with like a clay in order to create the heavens and the earth. So again, reading it in the Hebrew, you can well come up with a translation that goes, as God was creating the heavens and the earth, or while God was creating the heavens and the earth, or at the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was formless and void. And then it says, V'choshech al pnei tehom, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Tehom is the word in Hebrew for deep water, related perhaps to the Akkadian word Tiamat. This was an ancient Akkadian goddess, goddess of the deep. So, where would the Israelites have encountered Tiamat? Of course, in Babylonian captivity in the 500s BCE. And the suggestion is that the Israelite priests were encountering now all manner of pagan mythology from the Babylonians, such as their goddess Tiamat, and they just took this mythology and adapted it to their own Hebrew folklore about the creation. There was an entire Babylonian creation narrative known as the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish, that relates an account that is in some ways similar to what we see in the book of Genesis. And it includes a sea monster by the name of Yam, and we're told that the Babylonian god Marduk defeats the villain of primeval chaos. Chaos. The earth was formless and void, chaotic. And so it's said that the whole progression of the Genesis text is basically from chaos to cosmos. And Banstra cites us a couple of different scholars, McCurley and Bato, and gives us dates, who are all over this and arguing about it from a scholarly standpoint. And that is, in fact, the domain of scholarship. There's not one correct answer. It's a mystery, and a Sherlockian mystery, and that's the way we need to approach it. But imagine all the issues that it raises. Were the Israelites really copying from the Babylonians? You can argue yes, you can argue no, that's a stretch. And you're free to go either way in this particular course, especially as you're writing papers. So let's summarize the creation. Day 1, from Genesis 1, verses 3 to 5, light is created and light is separated from the darkness. Second day, verses 6 to 8, water and sky are created. The third day, verses 9 to 13, land and vegetation appear. The fourth day, verses 14 to 19, the sun, moon, and the stars appear. Which is curious because there was light and even vegetation, but no sun, moon, or stars. Day 5, verses 20 to 23, the fish and the birds were created. The sixth day, verses 24 rather to 31, beasts, and finally man is created. So that summarizes the 6 days of creation that we, of course, want to be familiar with. And then we have the classic verse, and I'll recite it again in the Hebrew. Vayomer Elohim naaseh Adam betzalmenu. There's our word Elohim, God. And God said, let us make the Adam in our image, betzalmenu. Well, that often gets rendered, let us make man in our own image, Adam, as it were. But really, when we look at the Hebrew carefully, where does Adam come from? Where does that word come from? Well, the Hebrew Adamah means earth or ground. And it's also related to the word Adom, which means red, as in red earth, or even blood. Adom, Adam. It's been suggested that really what we have here is the creation of an earth creature. Why say man? Isn't that a little bit gender conscious? And then what about this expression, let us make? That's another issue for our list. Let us make, na'aseh Adam. Let us make man. Let us make the earth creature. Why let us? Isn't God one? Isn't God singular? One suggestion is that the let us refers to God and the divine council. Perhaps the angels. God is speaking with the angels, the divine council, and saying, let us make man. Another academic issue is, do you suppose there might be some bleed over here from the ancient pagans? That this is actually a vestigial remnant of paganism, of polytheism. Of course, the pagans had many gods. So the Israelites just adopted the language of the pagans, essentially, and yet used their word Elohim, God. Or the Orthodox response is that when the text says, let us make, it's really a reflection of the royal we. God is speaking as a monarch would speak. Let us, really meaning let me. So in that case, the plural form here is just a literary convention. And you can argue this in any which direction, because there's not, as we mentioned, a single right answer. All issues. What about this earth creature? The traditional view from many folks is that this is the male creature, the Adam. But wait a second, let's look at the Hebrew again. Genesis 1:27. Let's start with that. And I'll read it in the Hebrew. V'yivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmenu. And God created the man in his image, but salmo, I should say, in his image. But Selem Elohim barauto, in the image of God, he created him. Zachar unekeva bara otam, male and female, he created them. V'yevarech otam Elohim, and God blessed them. V'yomer lehem Elohim, and God said to them, Pir'u urvu, be fruitful and multiply. But wait a second, there's no punctuation in the original Hebrew. There's no periods, there's no commas. It's all a question of where we want to insert those punctuation marks. So I'm going to read the same passage again, exact same words, but punctuate it differently with a very different meaning. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, and God created the earth creature in his image. But Selem Elohim bara oto zachar unekeva, in the image of God he created him male and female. And that's just as correct a reading as the traditional one. In other words, the earth creature was androgynous, was both. Is that a stretch of the text? Bara otam v'yevarech otam Elohim. God created them and blessed them. V'yomer lehem piru urevu, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. If you do think it's a stretch, what about chapter 5, verse 2? Zachar nekeva bra'am. Male and female he created them. V'yevarech otam. V'yikra et shmam Adam, and he blessed them and called their name Adam, b'yom hibaram, in the day of their creation. How about that? Clearly, this is what it says, and he called their name. It doesn't say called their names, called their name, singular, Adam, Adam. As if the text is shouting at us, in fact, that there's one earth creature containing both male and female. Their name, both of them, is Adam. And only later is the female separated out, the Eve, the female attribute separated out. And only then do we have the division of male and female. So some look at all of this and say, the image of God isn't something that we have. It's something that we do. And that's a very Jewish thought as well. Judaism is all about action, all about behavior. Then let's consider an interesting part of the text referred to as toldot, formulas. That's a Hebrew word, toldot. It translates as generations. From Genesis 2, verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created. Now, the Sherlockian sleuthing has determined that this single part of Genesis 2, verse 4, the part underlined in these notes, was the work of the priestly source, and that everything thereafter, in the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth, is actually the work of the Yahwist. Gets complicated, doesn't it? And again, some will come along and say this is all built on a great house of cards, this entire documentary hypothesis. Moreover, while Banstra attributes this to the priestly source, others attribute it to a later editor, a redactor. A redactor, introducing both narratives and lists, as these formulas do, and introducing texts that come from different sources. The work of a redactor as a way of editing the source texts of Genesis into a continuous story. The redactor derives the formula from a text that was originally an independent work. The Book of Records, as it's called, Toldot, which actually begins in Genesis 5, verse 1. That's another theory. So, which is it? In any case, it's theorized that these toldot, these formulas, are used to organize large blocks of text. It's also curious that the Yahwist story is supposed to be older. It's supposed to stem out of the Davidic dynasty, as we previously summarized. The dynasty of David, probably written at some point during the Israelite monarchy, the southern kingdom of Judah. That's the Yahwist. And that starts the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 is the Yahwist. But the younger priestly source, the one edited by those priests in exile in Babylon and at the return out of Babylonian captivity in the 500s BCE, that's the younger story, and it follows the older one. Isn't that curious? So, yet more problems with the documentary hypothesis and more issues for our list. But together forming a comprehensive world picture. This isn't about the dawn of Israel as a nation. This is about the creation of the world as we know it. And from that comprehensive picture, the narrative takes us to an intimate tale of the earliest human beings, of course, Adam and Eve. And again, there's interplay with other ancient literature. Eden sounds like a Sumerian word, Edin. which has to do with the steppe lands of ancient Mesopotamia. So maybe Eden can be rooted to that part of the world. Then there's the Babylonian term Edinu that signifies a plain or a desert. Again, which is it? And there's no consensus. There's no right answer. Is the word Eden from Eden, the Mesopotamian steppes, or is it from the Babylonian Edinu, plain or a desert? Then we have the Babylonian gods Enki and Ninhursag, and a garden called Dilmun, all present in the Babylonian mythology. And these gods and goddesses enjoyed goodness as long as they were near to the tree of life. And here we point you to Pritchard's classic text, The Ancient Near East, 1969, that provides English translations of a lot of this ancient mythology from various corners of the ancient Near East with parallels to the biblical text. And he'll have in the margins the exact chapter and verse of the Bible that parallels the Near Eastern text. So that's definitely a valuable resource for us in our research. So what kind of insights can we glean from this? Well, it says that Adam and Eve were naked. The word is erom, or it is similar to the word erom in Hebrew, meaning crafty. So is there a play on words between naked and crafty? What about original sin? Is there such a thing? Actually not in Jewish thought. Rather than people being born in sin and wickedness, there's the idea that everyone is born with a dual nature, a Yetzer Tov, a good nature, and a Yetzer Ra, an evil nature or an evil inclination, and that people get to choose all through their lives which they're going to follow. So life is about making choices, not about being forced to be evil. There's no devil made me do it attitude in Judaism. That's another insight. What about the serpent who tempts Eve? Well, a lot of Western thought will link the serpent with Satan, but there's no indication of this in the Hebrew text. In fact, the word serpent, nachash, connotes the idea of twisting, a twister, someone who twists the words of God. Did God really say that if you eat of this fruit, you shall die? So you can read the story on different levels. You can read it as a bedtime story for children. You can also read it as an allegory, something very symbolic. There's also a dragon named Lotan in Mesopotamian mythology, reflected in the Hebrew term Leviathan that we see elsewhere in the Bible. And we also see Apsu, or water, in Mesopotamian mythology. And what about the forbidden fruit? It does not say that's an apple in the biblical text. Not exactly sure what it might have been. Pomegranate, date, fig. But again, if it's all allegorical, does it really matter? And primeval sin? What is morality and what is sin? What is Eve guilty of doing? Of acting on her own judgment? Yes, she disobeys God, but she also takes a decision on her own part. And she decides that knowing everything she can about this incredible world that we've been placed in is more important than obeying a specific command from God. So she takes from the tree of knowledge. That's action. When you think about it, how do we decide in any narrative who the hero or heroine is. And the answer is you look on who is driving the action, who's moving the story along. And in this case, who is it? Is it Adam? No, it's Eve. So we can put on our feminist hats if we want and say that Eve is really depicted as the heroine of the story, not the great sinner. And if there's a fall, maybe it's a matter of falling up, that rather than a catastrophe, we wouldn't be fully human had not Eve taken of the tree of knowledge. This was a good thing, even a part of the divine will. But it's all a matter of which way you want to interpret the story and the insights that you want to draw. What is the tree of knowledge? What is knowledge? Is it pride? Is it simply knowing what God knows? Is that such a terrible thing? And what hints about sexuality might be present in the story? Some have tried to read it as a story of growing up and awakening to one's self and to sexuality, knowing oneself and knowing others. And the result is that there's no return at the end of the story to original innocence. And by the way, where was Adam during all of this? What's he doing? If he is supposed to be the man, why isn't he protecting his woman? He's just basically sitting in the corner, and Eve is driving the narrative. So it's easy to dump on Adam, to be sure. Moving along from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, their offspring, we meet Cain and Abel. And we're also mindful of Middle East mythology once again. A shepherd god known as Dumuzi engages in combat with a farmer god named Enkimdu, all over the goddess Inanna. And Dumuzi wins the favor in the context. So is this not a reflection of the Cain and Abel story, or vice versa? Is it just coincidence that these stories sound similar in a lot of respects? Maybe the Cain and Abel story, like the Mesopotamian story, is really a reflection of a conflict between ancient shepherds and ancient farmers. And who is preferred in the Cain and Abel story? Well, Abel brings the best of his flock, the shepherd, and Cain is not accepted. His offering is not accepted. He's only bringing of the fruit of the field. So again, the conflict between shepherds and farmers. Cain, of course, kills Abel and becomes the first murderer with an infamous mark on his forehead for the rest of his life. What about Genesis chapter 5 that tells us about Enoch, seventh descendant from Adam? Looking at the Hebrew, V'yithalech Chanoch et Elohim, and Enoch walked with God, it says, Ve'enenu, and he was not, ki lekachoto Elohim, because God took him. What on earth does this mean? It might just be a way of saying that Enoch had a close relationship with the divine, walked with God, and he wasn't, meaning he died. God took him. We don't know exactly what that means, but we do know that a lot of post-biblical folklore developed that read it in such a way as to suggest that Enoch was actually translated into the heavens. He went up into the heavens to meet God. We also meet Methuselah in this primeval story, the oldest human ever to live, 969 years. Incidentally, Methuselah Metushelach in Hebrew contains a bit of a prophecy that most people miss, not knowing the Hebrew. Metushelach, Methuselah, means when he dies, it is sent. And sure enough, if you follow the biblical chronology, you'll discover that immediately following Methuselah's death, something was sent: the waters of the flood, the deluge. Then there's this curious account of the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Curious indeed, and requiring some sleuthing. V'yir'u b'nei Elohim et benot ha'adam, reading it in the Hebrew, and the sons of God saw the daughters of the earth, ki tovot hena, for they were good. V'yikchu lahem nashim, mikol asher bacharu, and they took for themselves wives from among all whom they chose. So what does this mean? Who are the sons of God? Who are the sons of God? A lot of folklore arose in subsequent centuries suggesting that they were disobedient angels from the divine court who lusted after earth women and took for themselves wives. And then later in the account it says, "V'hanephilim hayu ba'aretz b'yamim hahem," and the Nephilim were in the earth in those days. The Nephilim, who are they? Maybe, according to this folklore, they're a race of giants who were the offspring of this incestuous pairing of the rebellious angels and the earth women. How do we understand all of this? Maybe, though, the text is simply talking about the interbreeding of the lines of Cain and Seth. That's what it means when it talks about the sons of God and taking women whomever they chose. We don't know. Very mysterious text indeed, and we get to haggle it all out as Sherlockian sleuths. What about the great flood of Noah? For one thing, we don't have any evidence at all that there was ever a worldwide deluge, even though there are some who try to suggest that the geologic record indicates this. It's more than a stretch, to say the least, to try to prove that there was ever a flood, a worldwide flood. But there may have been a local inundation or series of inundations, and some have even suggested that the flood of Noah represents the creation by inundation of the entire region today called the Black Sea. Or maybe it's all just mythology. We do have mythology of the ancient Near East known as the Gilgamesh epic, the story of Gilgamesh. And it also talks about floodwaters coming. It talks about a boat that is commanded to be built to save our righteous hero. So is the Bible copying the Gilgamesh epic and adapting it to its own purposes? In which case it would be guilty of a bit of plagiarism. But it does seem that the whole Noah story parallels the story of Adam in as much as it's a second beginning, a second creation account. Noah becomes the new Adam. And Noah is also told to be fruitful and multiply. So we can see the Noah story as a form of recreation of the world. And both Adam and Noah are implicated in wrongdoing. Noah, as we already mentioned, gets drunk after he comes off of the ark. So let's consider again the documentary hypothesis, also known as source analysis. The Yahwist, the J source, where we don't find any building of the ark at all. Not in J. The flood is the result of 40 days of rain receding in 7-day periods. The animals come into the ark in sevens, the clean animals in sevens, and the unclean animals in pairs. That's, according to source analysis, the J bits of the story. Then there are priestly, P sections of the flood story, which indicate that the flood is entirely supernatural. The windows of heaven are open. 150 days are mentioned, and 220 days are mentioned for the waters to recede. And we're simply told there's a single pair of each species, and there's no mention of any sacrifice on the part of Noah. So is it proper to subdivide the story in this way and look for parts of the Noah story that mention the YHWH divine name and other parts that are attributable to P? Is that proper? Is it correct? You can say it's the best Sherlockian sleuthing we can do. You can also say, hey, this is a house of cards. Is there then a literary wholeness to this text? Is there a symmetry to this text? Is there a unitary composition? And Bandstra cites Wenham, 1978. And of course, you're welcome to look into all of that scholarship. Following the flood is the story of Ham, Genesis 9. And Noah the husbandman began and planted a vineyard and drank of the wine and was drunken, uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, told his two brothers outside, and Shem and Japheth took a garment, put it upon their shoulders, went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were backward, so they didn't see him. So what's going on here? One scholar suggests that Ham may have actually committed incest with Noah's wife. Another suggests that Ham basically acquired Noah's, how shall we call it, mojo by seeing him naked. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew that what his youngest son had done to him, and said, "Cursed is Canaan, servant of servants. And blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be their servant. God enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be their servant." What about this curse on Ham? Pretty difficult to justify this. And it does seem to give Israel a religious right or a religious warrant later on in the narrative, as we shall see, to get rid of the Canaanites when, after the exodus out of Egypt, they conquer the land of Canaan. So some suggest that this story is basically fabricated and inserted into the whole Noah text in order to justify the Israelites' annihilation of the Canaanites. All an issue. The Tower of Babel, that we already summarized. We do note the presence of ancient towers in Babylonia, ziggurats. Ziggurat actually meaning a mountain peak. And the idea in ancient Mesopotamia being that the gods lived up in the mountains. And in fact, all over the ancient Near East. Zeus is up on Mount Olympus, and Baal is on Mount Saphon, that later might have been corrupted to Mount Zion, interestingly. That's an issue. And YHWH on a mountain called Sinai. So is all of that behind the story of the Tower of Babel? People decide they're going to build a tower into the heavens only to find that their language is confused and they're unable to complete it. In any case, Noah's drunkenness appears to have brought out the very worst in Ham, as evidenced in this monstrous city and tower project, the Tower of Babel. Narrowing the focus now to the line of Shem, and it's from that line that ultimately the great Israelite patriarch Avram, or Abram, later to be known as Avraham or Abraham, will follow, and all of Israel will follow that line. So let it be researched, so let it be done.